Top of the morning, Dan and Amy. I'm really interested in this research work of two Colby College professors on the rural voter in America. Of course, this has particular relevance to Illinois because if you follow Illinois politics, there's long been this dividing line. South of I-80 is downstate Illinois, and then south of Springfield is southern Illinois. And the antipathy that south of I-80 and certainly south of Springfield has for north of I-80, meaning Chicagoland, particularly the city of Chicago, and the legislation that's been introduced intermittently over the years to kick Chicago out of Illinois or to secede from Illinois, particular regions.
Have a southern Illinois and a northern Illinois.
Well, it's a little bit more layered than that, the political cake is, but that's sort of the general attitude, although it's always complicated because you have mid-sized urban centers around the state, as you do in some other states that have urban centers, but also a lot of exurban and rural areas too. It's just really interesting because what has happened during Trump is a resurgence of import among the rural electorate. Because one of the things that we've seen during the Trump era, if you will, is if Trump's not on the ballot, you see a drop-off, and we saw this in Wisconsin, you see a drop-off in rural voter turnout. And that's turnout Republicans need to win those states, to win state and local offices, because that's essentially center-right or Republican-leaning voters, if not straight-up conservatives, who are saying, I'm not coming out unless Trump is on the ballot, or perhaps candidates that are similarly disposed, both in terms of policy agenda as well as in terms of attitude.
And don't you think that's why some Democratic states wanted him off the ballot?
Well, I mean, I suppose, yeah. I mean, if you could get him off the ballot in a state like in a swing state like Wisconsin, then that would. I mean, I don't know how that would ever stand, but I mean, theoretically, as a thought exercise, sure. If you could get him in a swing state that's got an important rural electorate, then that could be advantageous. Yeah. But what is happening with the sort of rural electorate, I think, is a really interesting question, because the indication from this work that I referenced is that there is a bit of a realignment that is calcifying, and what that means for national elections in particular. So let's talk about it. The professors I mentioned are Nicholas Jacobs, Assistant Professor of Government at Colby College, and Daniel Shea, Professor of Government at Colby College, that's in Maine. Their book is The Rural Voter, The Politics of Place and the Disuniting of America. Professors Jacobs and Shea, thank you for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having us.
Well, why don't we just start with, what was the question you sought to answer when you took upon this research, and how you went about gathering the information to substantially answer it?
Yeah, thank you for that. So this is an attempt to fully understand what's on the minds of rural voters. As you've mentioned, it's pretty well known at this point that rural voters are increasingly voting Republican. I think they've always been important, and as Dan and I show in the book, they've increasingly become important to the Republican coalition since 1980. I think a lot of people started caring about rural Americans after Trump won them, but they've always been there. And what Dan and I are trying to do in this book is, I think, give them a voice, and not just view them as a cult of Trump, not just view them as sort of dispossessed, sort of Appalachian backwater folks, to really understand why they hold grievances towards government, why they're so distrusting of the Democratic Party. And to do so, we commissioned the largest survey of rural voters ever conducted for a single study. The survey interviewed 10,000 rural voters all across the country.
So who is the rural voter? Describe a typical rural voter to us.
Well, first off, thanks for having us on. Wonderful. Um, they tend to be more homogenous than other parts of the country. We know that. They tend to be a little bit older, less likely to have a college education. But when it comes to attitudinal issues, one of the bigger findings of the book is that on a number of policy questions, the rural voter is not much further to the right, in fact, not further to the right than other mainstream Republicans in non-rural areas. We went into this book thinking, well, we're going to find this bastion of policy extremists way out there. That's actually not what we find. We find that they have a very deep, important sense of place. They put geography where they live at the top of their concerns. They're concerned about their neighbors, what we call a shared fate. They believe that they're doing well if their neighbors are doing well. We think that's a bit different. And they are concerned about policy questions, but they're not much further out on the right than average Republicans are.
Let me posit a hypothesis and get your reaction from your research. And this really comes to me from Chris Arnatti, the photojournalist who spent a year going around the country and documenting the stories in small towns around the country of what he came to term back row Americans. And the front row Americans are, of course, the urban sophisticates and the suburban professionals and so forth. And so based on what you just said about actual policy positions and where they are on the ideological spectrum, is it possible that the rural voter feels like his government treats him like a back row American, and that's the mistrust of government and the antagonism towards the Democratic Party in particular?
I think the evidence is very clear on that point. And just to flesh out a little bit more of what Dan was speaking about and sort of building on your hypothesis, which I think is generally right. So oftentimes people use the rural-urban divide as incorrectly. That what they're really doing is they're making claims about what conservatives believe or what Republicans believe. And that's not distinctively rural. So there are millions more Trump voters living outside of rural America than within. We are specifically talking about 20% of the American population. That is a small part of the population that is distinct, though, on this idea. We gathered sizable evidence to suggest that rural Americans are much more likely to say that government neglects their views when making decisions about their community. Rural Americans are much more likely to say that the news and pop culture media portrays them in a negative light. That attitude is sizable and is found nowhere else in the country, right? Urbanites do not say that about how media portrays them. No, it's rural people that have this sense that they are being looked down upon. And, this is kind of going off the evidence a little bit. I think there's reason for that.
Well, right. And I mean, we have sort of a case study with respect to the train derailment in East Palestine, Ohio. And, you heard this over and over again from the residents on the ground there. Took a year for the president to show up. And we look at what happens when there are disasters in other places around the country, and the response is very different. And, it feels like you're a second-class citizen. That's what they're saying. Whether people want to agree that that's the case or not, that's what they're expressing in terms of their belief.
Well, we're often asked whether or not this is a top-down process, whether or not it's been cultivated by GOP elites, or whether or not it's a bottom-up, that there are genuine concerns that are driving this resentment. We think it's both. We have evidence to suggest that there are genuine concerns, just as you're talking about. There's a real feeling, and it's not simply made up. There are a lot of things, a lot of changes. We talk about the NAFTA ghost town, for example, the decline of manufacturing in rural areas, the disappearance of family farms, and so forth. So there are genuine concerns in rural America, a great deal of legitimate anxiety. But we also find in our research that over the years, over the past few decades, this idea that rural America is really the bastion of real America, and that you're special and that Democrats will do nothing for you, is also a handy tool for Republican operatives. So it's bottom up and top down.
So,
Well, I mean, just in Illinois, the state I know best. It's interesting what's happened over the last, say, 25 years. There were a lot of sort of conservative Democrats that occupied legislative seats and even congressional seats in central and southern Illinois. That's virtually gone, just as the Republicans have been virtually cleaned out of the suburbs. So, and I don't think that's, I mean, maybe the extent of it is unique in Illinois, but I don't think it's unique to Illinois, that dynamic. So there definitely is something going on as those communities change and as you say, less family businesses and family farms and less people, younger people, staying once they graduate from school and start working and so on and so forth. So there has to be something to that. That informs the attitude of the families that are staying in terms of their understanding of what's happening and at whose hands it's happening.
Well, the transformation is certainly not unique to Illinois, and I think that's why this is the rural voter. And Dan and I, in part of the book, we've been talking a lot about our survey evidence, but we go all the way back to 1824 to understand whether or not we've ever, as a country, experienced a rural-urban divide as large as we have. And we've had rural movements. We've had agrarian protest.
Sure.
You might remember, right, the populist of the late 1800s. But never, not even then, what did rural voters vote so uniformly and sort of at a national scale. And so these divides you're speaking about in Illinois are taking place in our home state of Maine. They're taking place all over the country. And you're right to pick up on this idea that there once was a conservative Democrat or a moderate Democrat that could compete in rural communities, could at least vie to represent rural needs and concerns. And there once was a similar force for Republicans in urban areas. And that's Dan and my main concern in this book. This is not a partisan screed. This is not an attempt to fundamentally reorient our politics around one particular vision of what's good for rural America. We just need our politics to work, and the system is broken, and who benefits are those that get to run for office without any real competition in rural areas and urban areas, and who loses are the rural communities that legitimately feel dispossessed of power, and for good reason. They don't have real choice when it comes to election day.
Now, in your opinion, does President Biden doing anything to try and attract the rural voters?
Well, there's no question he understands the importance, right? So, like I said, 20%. Let's put this in context. That's a more important group right now for Republican voters than young voters or black voters are for the Democratic coalition. So this is a really important group. And what we've seen over the years in some areas, some rural areas, you might find that a decade ago, Republicans were getting 65 and 67, maybe 70%. Now it's 80 and 85%. So if the Democrats and Joe Biden can't do something to keep those numbers down, to make some headways, it's going to be real trouble. So they are making some concerted efforts. We see that. He did have a rural initiative, economic initiative. Our evidence suggests it's not quite working yet. One of the issues that we've been talking about is that the president, in order to connect with rural voters, will have to particularize his message. All rural voters are not the same, right? Start talking about specific industries, specific communities, specific places of the country in rural America. So to answer your question, they understand it's important. Will it make a difference? Not sure.
Why?
If I may just...
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
If I may just quickly add to that, I mean, he's done more than Obama did. He has spoken more about rural issues than Hillary Clinton did in 2016, who seemed to just openly celebrate the fact that she performed miserably in rural areas on her Goldman Sachs speaking tour. But the thing that really frustrates me about that is, right, the bar was so low, and the distrust is so deeply embedded in rural communities towards the Democratic Party that it's such a simple mindset to say, oh, well, we threw some billions of dollars at you for broadband internet. Can you please come and thank us now at the ballot box?
Right.
I mean, these are communities where families have lived for generations. They have a deep, long memory of the social and economic and political tumult that has been generations long, and it's going to take a lot more than some gimmies, government grab bag to restore that trust.
Well, particularly when you sort of, again, insult people the way that Kamala Harris did when she defended opposition to voter ID for voting because people in rural areas don't have things like photocopiers and fax machines. I mean, it's just, it's like they're living in the 17th century or something outside of urban metropolises. That's the attitude that I think your research is speaking to. They feel like, I'm just some hayseed who doesn't know about how things work in the hustle and bustle of urban society and so forth. And that's not the case. It's cartoonish.
Well, thanks for saying that, and because it's precisely what we're trying to do with the book. We're trying to offer a full, empirical, and balanced take on this really important group. And very often the media gets it wrong and Democrats get it wrong, right? There's a number of issues, and we spend, for example, a good part of a chapter talking about portrayal of rural people in popular culture. This is if you're a rural person, it's tough, right? It's just, in some ways, it's almost the last group to be stereotyped, to offer wild tropes about who they are, all sorts of sitcoms and movies and so forth. Rural voters are paying attention, and they don't like it. So you're absolutely right, Dan. There's a lot of misperceptions out there, and one of the reasons why I wrote this book is to get at some of those.
Well, and then the flip side of that is, this is a question that as you mentioned, I saw an interview you gave to Politico. You sort of mentioned this too, that after the 2016 election, people inside the Beltway, like, wait a second, how did a real estate developer from Manhattan develop this loyalty among rural voters with whom he has nothing in common? So, explain, as I said at the outset, that they come out with enthusiasm for Trump in a way that they don't necessarily for other Republicans.
Yeah, but I'll just point out that this idea that because Donald Trump is not from a rural community, because he somewhat typifies an urban upbringing, urban lifestyle, that somehow rural voters are betraying it's just more evidence they use to suggest that rural voters are being duped, that they don't have serious concerns, that they're just fanatical out there in the countryside. You name the stereotype. Like, that's why they care so much about Donald Trump's upbringing and how non-rural it is. And, this is an important question. I'm not saying you shouldn't ask it. It is interesting why such a person with that background has such widespread appeal. Dan and I think, have a two-part response. One is to think about Trump historically, right? He does extraordinarily well. He does better in rural areas than any other Republican candidate. But he does benefit from a long decades transition in rural America towards the Republican. That is, he does sort of fit a trend line, and he does about as good in 2016 as you might expect if you follow that long trend line of partisan realignment in rural communities. So that's not to deny that there's something special about Trump, but it is to put him in appropriate context. Mm-hmm. The other thing, I think, we spent the better part of our time together talking about distrust and a long history of reactions towards government, a feeling of abandonment. If Donald Trump is not rural, and Donald Trump does not pretend to be rural.
Right.
He does not pretend to be anything he is not. And, I think rural Americans in 2016, with all those attitudes, with all that baggage, with all those feelings of frustrations and resentment, were more willing to throw their support behind the guy that at least was appearing authentic to them than the candidate that was trying to appeal to a stereotyped version of them.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, that's my experience. I've seen it a million times on the campaign trail in Illinois. Somebody from Chicagoland goes downstate, and then it's the Carhartt jacket and the cowboy boots and the corncob pipe or the overalls. I mean, it's just so painful, and yet it still happens. It's really interesting. Nicholas Jacobs and Daniel Shea, they're professors of government at Colby College. The book, The Rural Voter, The Politics of Place and the Disuniting of America. Professors Jacobs and Shea, thanks so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And do us a favor. Send us some of that 75-degree weather, would you?
Yeah.
Well, it's going to change tomorrow, wind chill of 5 degrees, so we'll enjoy today while we can.
Well, you can keep that.
Yeah. All right. Thank you two so very much. And they both joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.
It's what Chicago is talking about.